Hi, this is your host. Today's question is, what really happened to Air India Flight 171? And this was the first episode in the series of the same name. If you want to watch the rest of the episodes, they're all linked in the description below. You can also find more information about this case on my blog, which is linked below as well. On June 26, 1950, an Indian Airlines aircraft departed from Mumbai for Delhi. The flight was uneventful until the crew made contact with Kolkata ATC and requested clearance to descend from their cruising altitude of 19,000 feet down to 10,000 feet. As the plane started its descent, the pilots noted that the altimeter setting for Kolkata Airport was 30 inches of mercury, which meant that the current atmospheric pressure at their cruising altitude was equivalent to an altitude of 12,000 feet. Therefore, when they were cleared to 10,000 feet, the pilots knew that their actual altitude would be 8,000 feet. This was not a problem. The pilots had flown in these conditions many times before. Once the aircraft was approaching Kolkata, the pilots engaged the autopilot to assist them during the final approach. At 17:47 UTC, the pilots turned onto the final approach course. A few minutes later, as the plane was making the turn, the autopilot disengaged itself. The pilots were alerted to this by an audible warning tone and a corresponding light on the control panel. This wasn't particularly unusual. Autopilots disengaged themselves quite frequently, and it was second nature to the pilots to re-engage it once they decompleted the turn. But as the pilots reached for the autopilot switch, they heard another sound, a sound that neither of them had ever heard before. It was described as being similar to the sound made by a jet engine when a plane is about to take off. But coming from inside the plane, the sound got progressively louder, peaking for a few seconds and then rapidly disappearing. Immediately after the noise, the plane started to shake violently, and the pilots wrestled with the controls to keep the plane stable. The captain managed to stabilize the plane and called the first officer to check the cargo door to see if it was properly closed. It wasn't. They struggled to close it, but the vibrations from the previous turbulence had jammed the door latch. Eventually, they managed to get the door closed and latched. After that, there were no more problems, and the plane landed safely. The airline sent a maintenance team to inspect the plane. Nothing out of the ordinary was found. The pilots were debriefed, and they reported everything that had happened to the air traffic controller. However, at no point did they report hearing the mysterious noise. Despite this, the captain was questioned about the incident because he had radioed ATC, asking for the cargo door to be checked. He explained what had happened and added that they must have inadvertently opened the cargo door while they were maneuvering the plane. The airline accepted his explanation, and the matter was closed. However, the Directorate General of Civil Aviation wanted a second opinion, so they asked the Aircraft and Armament Inspection Establishment to conduct an inquiry. Their inspectors found no evidence of sabotage or negligence. The report was submitted, and the file was shelved. 2 weeks later, the same thing happened again. The pilots were carrying out a similar maneuver, and the autopilot disengaged itself. The captain banked the plane away from Kolkata Airport to the right of the runway. Just as the left wing was at the bottom of the turn, they felt another jolt, and the plane shook violently. The captain held the plane steady as the first officer tried to close the cargo door, which had once again come unlatched. The plane shook so violently that the food tray in the galley compartment came loose and slid forward, injuring the purser. Once the cargo door was secured, the pilots continued with the approach and landed without any further incident. This time the pilots reported the noise, and everything was investigated. Again, the aircraft was thoroughly examined, but nothing could be found. The pilots were interviewed separately, and they both agreed that they hadn't done anything wrong. They both admitted that they didn't like flying in such thin air, but insisted that their decision to make the turn at low altitude had been correct. The noise they heard couldn't be explained, and all efforts to recreate it in a simulator failed. In the end, the DGCA decided to ground the crew pending the outcome of a court of inquiry. Then 2 days later, a third accident occurred. During the landing, the captain became briefly incapacitated due to hypoxia. With no other pilots on board, the first officer was forced to land the plane alone. He brought the plane down safely, but the damage caused by the hard landing rendered the plane grounded. Now the pilots were eventually cleared to fly again, but they remained convinced that something was wrong with the aircraft. They argued that if the plane was safe to fly, then why did they keep experiencing these events? In response, the DGC suspended the captain and revoked the first officer's license to fly. The pilots protested, but their protests were ignored. And so the incidents were forgotten about until 2015, when the BBC ran a documentary on the de Havilland Comet. The Comet was the first commercial jet airliner, and some of the early models suffered from catastrophic decompression mid-flight. Some people who worked on the Comet project claimed that the reason for the de Havilland Comet's poor safety record was due to Indian Airlines sending its pilots to England to train on the new Comet, thus depriving Britain of its best and most experienced pilots. That theory was quickly dismissed, because there was no way that a lack of pilots would cause the plane to explode mid-flight. However, one theory suggested that pilots might have experienced spatial disorientation while flying the Comet due to a lack of proper instruments. That theory caught the attention of officials who decided to reopen the investigation into the accidents. A thorough review of all the evidence was conducted, and a report was published. In it, they concluded that the accidents were most likely due to a rapid decompression in the cabin, which in turn caused explosive decompression sickness. What caused the decompression remains unknown, but it's speculated that the increased vibrations caused by the autopilot disconnecting itself somehow compromised the structural integrity of the aircraft, causing the decompression. But there is one small problem with that theory. Explosive decompression sickness only occurs when the external pressure drops significantly faster than the internal pressure. And for that to occur, the plane would need to suffer a rapid decompression. Something like a bomb going off or a window shattering. But that didn't happen. No one on board heard or felt a sudden rush of air, nor was there any evidence of explosive decompression when the planes were inspected. Then in 2022, the Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau of India took over the case. Now they had access to more modern technology, including a simulator, which allowed them to accurately recreate the scenario that the pilots had described. Before starting their work, they knew what the problem was. The issue they were investigating had already been documented by another organization almost 70 years ago. The pilots of Air India Flight 171 had experienced something called dynamic stall. As the aircraft flew through the mountains near Kolkata, the wings were subjected to varying amounts of pressure, which created a difference in pressure between the front and the back of the wing. This resulted in the plane losing lift and stalling. As the pilots tried to recover from the stall by pushing the nose of the plane down, the plane entered a violent oscillation, which gave the pilots the sensation of the plane violently shaking. This was later confirmed in the simulator. So what caused the stall in the first place? Well, the pilots were flying the plane in icing conditions. Ice tends to accumulate at the leading edge of the wing, which disrupts the smooth airflow over the surface of the wing. When that happens, the wing loses lift and the plane stalls. Now, this could have been avoided if the pilots had followed the rule of thumb for single-engine planes, which states that if the outside temperature is below 10 degrees Celsius, then you should expect icing conditions. However, the pilots weren't aware of that rule, and even if they were, they would have known that it applied to them because the temperature at their cruising altitude was well above freezing. Even though icing conditions were present, icing wasn't the primary cause of the accident. That title belongs to the autopilot system. When the autopilot was engaged, it maintained a constant pitch attitude for the plane, which prevented ice from forming on the wings. But when the autopilot was disengaged, the plane pitched up and down, which caused the ice to melt and refreeze on the wings, which ultimately led to the stall. So there we have it, the truth behind what really happened to Air India Flight 171. Do you think the pilots were justified in speaking out against the airline? Let me know in the comments below. If you want to watch the next episode in this series, then click here. Otherwise, click here to watch one of these videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.